Okay, as I mentioned before, for those of you who want to start early, you'll have the opportunity to do that. I'll be here probably around 4:30, and we'll have the test open up at 5 o'clock. And for those of you who can't make it at 5, no harm, no foul. Show up at 5:30 or whatever time you can, and you guys will have till about 7:30 or so to complete the test. Really should be no surprises in terms of the format of the test. It's going to be just like any of the other tests. There should be no surprises in terms of the data that you need to know in preparation for the test. There's a handout there where I've summarized all the key physiological data for you. So just to be very clear, you should know all the data that's on that sheet. Is there anybody here who came away with a different thought? No? Good. There's going to be calculations you're going to have to do. The homework assignment was basically a way to prep you or prepare you for that. I'm always surprised when I sit there and teach this class and I say, if I can meet you 50 years downstream and I ask you what was the most important thing, you said it's a Framingham study. I'm always surprised that there are students on the final who just don't get that question right. Do you think that question is going to be on the final? I think so. If I see you at the mall or over at Bass outdoor, have you guys been to Bass down here? Nobody's been there? You guys should go. It's pretty impressive. Anyways, if I see you anywhere, I'm going to ask you that question. What was the most important thing you learned in my class? All right. Now it's time to get serious. Let's see here. Review session this Saturday morning, May the 18th, 9 a.m. We've had some really nice sessions in the past, so please prepare for this and take it seriously. Pressure volume diagram lab. Again, that really is in preparation for the final. The supplemental lecture, basically I told you last week I was going to take care of that in class, which I did. All of you should know that you can determine the oxygen uptake of an individual at the whole body level by measuring the ventilation rate and by measuring the fraction of expired oxygen. All of you know what the fraction of inspired oxygen is. At the tissue level, there's a different technique that can be used, and that's known as the Fick principle. And remember last week I really tried to emphasize to you that the Fick principle is entirely different than Fick's law of diffusion. Fick's law of diffusion applies to steps 2 and 4 of the 5-step model, which is where diffusion occurs. The Fick principle we could apply to any tissue bed. And then I posted the learning objectives for test number 4, so those are out there. And of course, there could be things on the test that aren't listed in the learning objectives. The learning objectives are there simply to be a guidepost to emphasize some of the most important concepts of the class. In looking at the learning objectives, there were a couple terms that I did not cover last week as it relates to the performance of the heart. At least I don't think I did. And so I want to just cover these two with you. So if we talk about, that was good. If we talk about chronotropy or chronotropic, I'm hoping all of you would sit there and take a look at this part of the word chrono and sit there and say, that's some type of term that's related to time, which it is. And so when we talk about chronotropy, what we're really talking about is heart rate. So if we sit there and say that there's a positive chronotropic effect, what we're simply saying is that there was an increase in heart rate. If we sit there and say that there was a negative chronotropic effect, what we mean is that there was a decrease in heart rate. And quick story, I mentioned to you, I had this guy that worked for me, he was 42 years old, ex-merchant Marine. This was at the Long Beach YMCA way back when. And we had a gentleman who belonged to the Y. We had handball courts and racquetball courts, which were very popular back in the mid-70s, mid-80s. Anyways, this guy sat there and he did a exercise test for me. His heart rate did not go up at all. At all. I'm hoping all of you would sit there and say, that's not what happens to me when I exercise. I know my heart rate goes up. And so he got done and he goes, I'm in great shape. He goes, because my heart rate didn't even go up. And I sat there and said, hey, Hal, we need to get you to go see Dr. Ellistad, who's a very, very well-known cardiologist in Long Beach, to do a stress test. Because I go, your exercise response was very abnormal, not normal at all. And so he went and he had 4-vessel disease, and basically he's got blockage of 4 main coronary arteries. And so he's supposed to go get a bypass surgery, and he tells his friend, he goes, screw it. He goes, if I'm gonna die, he goes, I'm gonna die on the racquetball court. Well, he didn't get his wish, but he did die in the YMCA. So I'm in my office, the guy comes running in, he goes, hey, he goes, so-and-so's down on the ground in the shower. So I go running on in there. Right off the bat, I'm already thinking, I know it's happened. There he is, as white as a sheet. And we start trying to do CPR, the paramedics get there, they hook him up, baseline, and that was the end of the story for him. So, was that a normal chronotropic response or an abnormal chronotropic response? And the answer is very abnormal. The other term that's very important is inotropic or inotropy. And this term is in reference to the contractility of the heart. Now, previously you learned about ionotropic systems. Ionotropic systems are systems that are involved in cell-to-cell communication that involve receptor-gated ion channels. This is a different word. This isn't ionotropic, this is inotropic. And this term is in reference to the contractility of the heart. Okay, how would you measure the contractility of the heart? Anybody? You're not going to look at me, huh? You're not going to make eye contact with me. How would you measure the contractility of the heart? Or what measurement might you use to give you insight in terms of the contractility of the heart? What? EDV? Okay, well, at least you're kind of in the diagram. Anybody else besides Jonathan? We'll get to Jonathan in a moment. Yes.
Ejection fraction.
Oh, Fantastic, very nice, very, very nice. Ejection fraction, that's exactly right. Is that we know that the ejection fraction normally should be around 50 to 65%. With exercise, however, we've got the sympathetic nervous system dumping all this norepinephrine onto the heart. And so remember, that's going to cause increased calcium. That's going to cause the heart to contract with more force. So during exercise, we're expecting the ejection fraction to go up. That's fantastic. So if you have an individual, let's say, so let me just back up and say this again. During exercise, we expect the ejection fraction to go up. You could be at 50% before the test begins, and then over the course of time, your ejection fraction rises, let's say 65, 67, 70%. But let's say that we have an individual who's got cardiovascular disease, and when the heart is stressed, it doesn't get enough oxygen. There, you may have a situation where the ejection fraction goes the opposite way. Instead of going up, it starts to dip down. That's a very bad sign right there. That's a heart that's in deep trouble. That would be a negative inotropic response. So negative inotropic response would it be a decrease in ejection fraction. And as I said, anytime we physically stress the body, we're expecting to see a positive inotropic response. Okay, so there's those terms. Remember, I've used the term ectopy with you. Ectopy means that the cardiac cycle was initiated somewhere else other than the SA node. It could be in the atrium. It could actually be in the AV node. You could have a junctional beat. That would be ectopic. You could have premature ventricular contractions. That's ectopic. Anything outside of the SA node that initiates the cardiac cycle, by definition, is a form of ectopy. Very common in the clinical world, somebody's having, say, premature ventricular contraction, and you see something like during the exercise test, there were multiple ectopic beats. What that means is that from one beat to the other, it's being initiated in different regions of the heart. And you know this because the EKG looks abnormal, but each abnormal QRS complex has its own distinct shape. That tells you that the activity is being activated in different regions of the heart. Okay, any questions about that? Confusion? All right, hearing none. Let's get into tonight's lecture here. Let me, what did I do here? What did I do? What did I do? There we go. So we left off last week talking about these different processes that are performed by the nephron. And there are 4 of them. And we just start with the first one, which is filtration. Then we've got reabsorption. We have excretion. That's basically the formation of urine. And then we have secretion. And we're going to focus on filtration, reabsorption, and excretion. So tonight, we're going to start out I'll just provide kind of a summary drawing, just like I did last week. And then we're going to address factors that regulate the filtration rate, or what is referred to as the glomerular filtration rate. Clinically, this is referred to as GFR. GFR, you're not going to hear anybody walk around going, glomerular filtration rate. First of all, saying the word glomerular is just not that easy. So why not just go GFR? It's simple. So what you're going to learn is that there are three forces that affect the filtration rate. One is the hydrostatic pressure within the capillary, that's P-cap, so that's within the glomerular capillary. There's the hydrostatic pressure in Bowman's capsule, and then there's what's referred to as the osmotic pressure in the glomerular capillary, that's pi-cap. And tonight I'm not going to talk about Starling forces, but I will come back to that on Wednesday night. We'll have you guys do some calculations for that. And then once I'm done with that, then we're going to get into talking about the reabsorption of sodium, glucose, hydrogen ions, and sodium potassium chloride. And from there, I think I mentioned this to you, is that when you think about these different aspects of physiology, and like I've told you before, when we think about neurophysiology, one of the things you got to be thinking about are action potentials. When we talk about skeletal muscle, one of the things you got to be thinking about is the length-tension relationship. For respiratory physiology, it's the O2 dissociation curve. In renal physiology, one of the most important stories is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone story. And you'll learn that there are cells within the afferent arteriole that act as renal baroreceptors. So there are these pressure sensors built in that are looking at the pressure within the blood vessels and the afferent arteriole specifically. Okay, so that's where we're going. Hush. Let me hush my phone. Okay. So here's a drawing very similar to what I showed you. Last week we got our afferent arteriole, which is represented by this segment. That then gives rise to what we're going to refer to as glomerular capillary, and then we've got the efferent arteriole. And you can just check your notes. You should have all this in there. And of critical importance is the glomerular capillary. And one of the things that I stressed to you last week is that the walls of the glomerular capillary have these openings in them that are known as fenestrations. And these fenestrations make the glomerular capillary very, very leaky compared to the other capillaries of the body. And a point that I emphasize to you is that if you took all the other capillaries of the body, other than the glomerular capillaries, they filter about 1.8 liters of plasma a day. Whereas the glomerular capillary is filtering 180 liters a day. That's 100 times more fluid going through the glomerular capillaries. So normal capillaries are not very leaky. The glomerular capillaries are very leaky. Wrapped around the glomerular capillaries, we've got Bowman's capsule, which I'm simply representing by this region here. Then we've got the proximal tubule. That then gives rise to the thick descending loop of Henle, which gives rise to the thin loop of Henle. That gives rise to the thick ascending loop of Henle, and then the distal tubule, and then ultimately our collecting duct. And just as I did last week, I'm going to put this little cylinder-like object going across this diagram, and you're going to tell me that that is meant to represent the peritubular capillaries. And you're going to tell me that in reality, the peritubular capillaries is wrapped around this tubular network, or the tubular segment of an nephron. So hopefully that part is clear. All right, last week, we talked about step number 1, which is filtration. And our standard textbook value for the glomerular filtration rate is 100 milliliters per minute. So normal GFR is 100 mLs per minute. So beneath this arrow, I'm going to write GFR, and I'm going to put equals 100 milliliters per minute. Simran, what's the normal blood glucose?
100 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters.
So again, 100 milligrams of glucose per what?
Is it 10 grams? 10 grams of glucose per 100 milliliters?
100 milligrams of glucose. Steven's over here going, don't ask me. Moccasin, they're going 100 milligrams of glucose per 100 mLs, right? Time to do a little calculation. I want to know, what is the filtration rate of glucose per day? Go for it. You know what the GFR is. You know what the normal concentration glucose is. I'm assuming that all of you know how many minutes there are in an hour and how many hours there are in a day. Man, I wish I had like $1 billion. Imagine I could come in here every night and we could have like a contest, right? It could be like Trivial Pursuit. No, we want it to be trivial. Wheel of Fortune? Jeopardy. You guys could be playing for like $1 million a night. This would be the best class you ever had. Mia, got the answer? Sean Sinner, don't look at me. You have the answer?
No, you read me right.
Okay. Got the answer? Do you have an answer? No, negative. I forget.
I did too, that's what I'm asking you.
Wait, what?
100 milligrams of glucose per 100 mLs.
Tell me what?
He's 60 minutes in an hour. That's 24 hours in a day. He's 100 times 60 times 24.
Do you have the answer? That's good.
To cancel out. So 700 grams of glucose per minute.
Oh, okay, yeah, I was getting a really big number.
Well, you
Are
got
we supposed to find per hour?
Because it's in milligrams.
Per day. Oh, per day.
I'm waiting for Mr. Ramos to finish. Because Zane, Zane's like he's like a secret weapon. He's got the best grade in class.
You got $1 million bucks?
Huh?
You got $1 million bucks?
Oh, you wanna take some of my money from me? Let's see, anybody wanna volunteer? Go ahead.
144,000 milligrams
Okay, here's the next part of the question for you guys. That's good, and by the way, how many of you got 144,000? Ballpark, I mean, even if you sat there and said 130 or 150, you're in the right ballpark. Here's what I wanna know next. How many moles of glucose is that? So it's 144,000 milligrams or 144 grams, right? And the question is, how many moles of glucose is that? It doesn't sound like too many to me, but it might be. Stevie, you got the answer already? Well,
I don't know what you have in your sheet.
one thousand milligrams and one.
Yeah.
I don't know. 100 milligrams.
So we're gonna do it again.
Wait, I think.
No, 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 you're right.
Okay, very good. Some of you for sure got the right answer, but I'm gonna be an approximator. I know that the molecular weight of glucose is 180 grams per mole. You guys got 144 grams. That's what, I'm gonna say 0.8 moles. How much glucose shows up in your urine every day?
Zero?
That's correct. So sit there and think about how amazing that machine is over there. Every day, it's filtering, every day. 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, which is a number that none of us can count to. And oh, by the way, go find out how long it takes a computer to count that high, okay? Because that's an amazingly huge number. 6.02 times the 10 to the 23rd is a ginormous number. And every day faithfully puts back into the circulation 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd molecules of glucose. That's a pretty damn impressive machine. All right. I'm just trying to impress upon you. Part of what I started out this class with is that human life, most all life forms are flat out miracles. All right, so filtration rate is 100 milliliters per minute. We've got to reabsorb a lot of this, so this is number 2, step 2, which we're referring to as reabsorption. And reabsorption within the proximal tubule accounts for about 60% of the filtrate. So the proximal tubule is the prime location that's responsible for reabsorbing most of what the kidney filters every day. The thick ascending loop of Henle is another very important region where reabsorption occurs. And this is where about 20% of the filtrate is reabsorbed. The distal tubule, about 10%. And the collecting duct is about 9%. We can write a simple mathematical formula that illustrates for us the relationship between excretion, filtration, and reabsorption. And here's our formula. The formula says that the excretion rate and we're going to put subscript X. X is a wild card, meaning it could be the excretion rate of anything, is equal to the filtration rate of X minus the reabsorption rate of X. Very simple formula. We're going to make it a little bit more complicated, not terribly more, but a little bit more. Step 3 is excretion. And the textbook rate for excretion is approximately 1 milliliter per minute. Milliliter per minute. How many liters is that per day?
Around 1.8 liters per day, that's what you said last time.
About 1.8 liters, approximately. If we use the number of minutes in a day, it would be about 1.4 liters. How many glasses of water are you supposed to drink a day? Just asking. How many? You know what? 8 glasses of water comes to be 1.4, 1.5 liters per day. You're pissing away 1.4, 1.5 liters of your blood volume, and you're putting back 1.4, 1.5 liters of blood volume by drinking. And that's how you come up with, why is it that we drink that much? Well, because that's what we're excreting every day. We're just simply replacing that blood volume, that lost blood volume. Okay, so now let's get in a little bit more detail about what's going on with the filtration rate. And that takes us over here to our equation. So the filtration rate of any substance is dependent upon pKa. This is the hydrostatic pressure within the glomerular capillary, right here. Before I go any further though, I need to back up for just a moment. I want to talk about these fenestrations. So anybody can help me out? These fenestrations allow everything to pass through them with the exception of what?
Cells?
Cells, that's right. What else? 2 things. First one's cells, which is very good. Anybody?
Large proteins?
Proteins, that's exactly right, proteins. So these holes are large enough to allow everything to go through them with the exception of cells and proteins. Everybody with me on that? So is it normal for you to have blood in your urine? And all of you know the answer to that. The answer is no. So sit there and imagine if you look at these crazy fighters nowadays, these mixed martial arts folks, they get in the ring, man, they get pummeled. Some of them get hit back here in their kidneys. And that can cause damage to the kidneys, and they show up with urine in their blood. For football players, I'm talking about real football, not soccer. Well, they wear protective pads to protect the kidneys so that if you get hit, which you're going to get hit if you play football, you're not damaging the kidneys, and you're not going to have urine blood. Boxing, very, very common for people to kind of reach behind and hit back into the kidney area. So, blood can show up in the urine, but that's a sign of damage to the kidney, and more specifically to the glomerular capillaries, which now are allowing everything to flow through them, including red blood cells. So everything can flow through here, with the exception under normal cases or conditions, everything but cells and proteins. Test question time. Kai, what's the concentration of sodium right here in the plasma? You know? Okay. Anybody, what's the concentration of sodium here in the plasma? Remember, the concentration of sodium is identical to the concentration of sodium in the interstitial space. Those two compartments are in equilibrium with one another. So, anybody help me out? What's the concentration of sodium in the plasma? By the way, that's in your data that you need to know for test number 4. Something we've talked about all semester long. It's 140 millimolar, that's exactly right. If these fenestrations allow everything to move through, with the exception of red blood cells and proteins, if the concentration of sodium here is 140 millimolar, what's the concentration of sodium here? It's 140 millimolar. Everything is passing through in exactly the same proportion that's found in the plasma. What's the concentration of potassium here? And hopefully all of you would tell me it's 4 millimolar. What would be the concentration of potassium here? 4 millimolar. What's the concentration of glucose here? 100 milligrams per 100 mLs. What's the concentration of glucose here? 100 milligrams per 100 mLs. Everything is passing through in exactly the same proportion or the concentration as what's found in the plasma. All right. Getting that out of the way. So let's come in here and we're going to say that P cap is approximately 55 millimeters of mercury. So just look at the board for a moment. P cap favors filtration. It's a force that's driving fluid into Bowman's capsule. So that's the driving force that's pushing the filtrate into Bowman's capsule. There is a pressure, however, within Bowman's capsule. And that pressure is about 15 millimeters of mercury. And the pressure in Bowman's capsule is opposing the pressure in the glomerular capillary. So here I'm going to write, first of all, PVC, and I'm just going to have a short little arrow pointing back towards the glomerular capillary, and here I'm going to write approximately 15 millimeters of mercury. Right now you would sit there and tell me that there's a net force of what? There's a net force of 40 millimeters of mercury that favors filtration. I'll come back, I'll put these numbers back up here, but Okay, now a few moments ago I told you that everything can filter through those fenestrations with the exception of two things, red blood cells and proteins. It's the proteins that we're interested in. So here's a volume of plasma. And I'm just going to put some little red dots in here. Hopefully this shows up in the back, but maybe not. Sorry about that. I'm putting 4 little red dots. I'm going to put 1 black dot in that given volume. What happens is that as this volume of plasma moves its way through the glomerular capillary, some of the water is moving into Bowman's capsule. Ms. Rodriguez, what does that do to the concentration of the proteins in the plasma? Does the concentration go down? Does the concentration stay the same? Or does the concentration of the protein go up? It goes up, that's exactly right. Yeah? The concentration of the protein goes up because the water is leaving the protein behind. Water is going into Bowman's capsule, the protein cannot follow it. So the concentration of proteins increases as the plasma flows through the glomerular capillary. So here I'm going to draw the same box. Of course, it's not the same box, but it's supposed to be. And since some of the water has left, I'm going to show, instead of 4 red dots, I'm going to show 3 red dots. And instead of 1 black dot, which is supposed to represent protein, I'm going to show 2. And so, as I'm trying to indicate, as water is leaving the glomerular capillary, by definition, the concentration of proteins has to go up. Luis, you're up to bat. Why do we care? From a physiological point of view, why do we care?
Because you want the amount of protein, the concentration in your blood to stay the same.
All right, so how do we do that?
We reintroduce the water,
We need to do what?
add more water.
We got to get water, right?
Yeah.
And the movement of water is known as what?
Osmosis.
Osmosis, that's right. So there's an osmotic pressure. And that osmotic pressure is caused by an increase in the concentration of proteins. And so this wants to pull water back in this direction. And so this is pi cap. Pi cap is the osmotic pressure within the glomerular capillary that's caused by this increase in the concentration of proteins. And pi cap has got a value of about 30 millimeters of mercury. Mia, I need you to give me the net force that favors filtration. Say again? No, no. It's not that movie to tell me. What's our net force that favors filtration? Zane, how about you? what's the net force? Eunice, did you have your answer up? Your hand?
Is that 10 million?
She was doing this to me, she was going. That's the correct answer, 10 millimeters of mercury, that's exactly right. Don't know if you've ever had this happen to you. I'm only basing what I'm gonna say based upon my crazy friends I used to hang out with. But they would go out drinking and they would drink some beer, a lot of beer. And after a bit, they'd sit there and say, excuse me, I gotta go visit the restroom. Why would that be? What the heck is going on with that? Anybody?
When you break the seal, it don't stop.
Okay, that's very good. That's the first time I've heard that answer in this class, but it's a good one. But, because you're onto something here, we're gonna have you try to answer this question for us. And you know what? It all starts in our algorithm for cardiac output. Go for it.
Oh, why we pee so much when we drink?
That's right. It's all in that algorithm, is it not?
No idea.
I knew you were gonna say that, because I also heard you sit there and go, ask Jonathan, ask Jonathan. And Jonathan's going, ask Simran. Simran's going, ask Zane. He's the sleeper in here. Stephen, what are you gonna say?
So,
He's speechless.
Is it something about the Sterling model?
No,
No.
no.
Is it increased blood volume?
Say it louder.
Increased blood volume.
Ah, increased blood volume. Okay, who gives a rip? Why, so what? What's the big deal if blood volume goes up?
Increased filling pressure.
Increases filling pressure, okay? You're starting to get my interest here.
Increased EDV.
Okay, increase EDV, all right.
Increased cardiac output.
Increase cardiac output. What's gonna happen to mean arterial pressure? Do you know a formula for that?
It'll go up.
It will go up, that's exactly right. And our little pressure sensors that we've got here, and also in our kidneys, which you're gonna learn more about, they're gonna see the pressure's gone up, right? And so how do we get that pressure down?
That's why you pee.
Huh?
That's why you pee. You get-
So we get our blood pressure down because now what's happened is you told me that the mean arterial pressure is gonna go up, right? If the mean arterial pressure is gonna go up, what's gonna happen to P-cap? Is P-cap gonna stay at 55 millimeters of mercury? Is P-cap gonna go down to 30 millimeters of mercury? Or is P-cap gonna go above 30 millimeters, or 55 millimeters of mercury?
Is it above?
It will be, because you told me that the mean arterial pressure is gonna go up, which means that the pressure here, the hydrostatic pressure in Bowman's capsule is gonna go up. And according to this formula over here, if that goes up, then that goes up, by definition, that goes up, and by definition, that goes up. Okay, let me take the time out. Remember, one of the things that I try to alert you to is that your kidneys play a fundamental role in regulating cardiac performance. And how do they do that? By controlling blood volume. If you sit there and go back to the lecture last Wednesday night, there were 5 functions that were performed by the kidneys, and one of them is controlling blood volume. And the point I made to you is, why do we care about controlling blood volume? And the answer is because we control the performance of the heart. So this algorithm that we're developing here, this fits in the cardiac output algorithm, and this fits underneath blood volume. And I'll come back, I'll show you how all that fits together. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle put together. So I'm just going to come back up here. Make sure that you're thinking about osmotic pressures now. We haven't talked about osmotic pressure for quite a while. So we've got PCAP, we've got PVC, and we've got PICAP. PCAP is 55 millimeters of mercury. PVC opposes PCAP. It's got a value of approximately 15 millimeters of mercury. And PICAP also opposes filtration, and its value, as we just talked about a few moments ago, is approximately 30 millimeters of mercury, yielding a net filtration rate of about 10 millimeters of mercury. And here I'm just going to put those same values here. All right. Well, now we're over on this part of our equation. So we're over on the reabsorption of X. X is a wild card, could be anything you want it to be. Here's a basic rule. I'm not going to say it's an absolute rule, but it's a pretty good rule to use. And here it goes. The reabsorption of everything is linked to the reabsorption of sodium. Say that again. The reabsorption of everything is linked to the reabsorption of sodium. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come along and I'm going to just modify our diagram over here. And now what we're trying to do is just zoom in on the proximal tubule. And please appreciate that this is a circular type of structure. So there's really no top or bottom, even though in the two-dimensional drawing there appears to be a top and a bottom. So what I'm going to draw on top applies for the entirety of the circumference of the proximal tubule. And here's a tubular epithelial cell. And these are the cells that actually make up the structure of the proximal tubule. And lo and behold, within the membrane that makes up the lumen of the proximal tubule, there are sodium ion channels. Oh, my lord. Sodium ion channels. All right. Mr. Vadi, what's the concentration of sodium in the plasma?
14 millimolar.
My hearing is going as I'm getting older, definitely. But it sounds to me, I hear her ringing and she's saying 140 millimolar. Did I hear you right? I think I did. The concentration of sodium here is 140 millimolar. And just to repeat what I said before, there are compartments, fluid compartments. There's the extracellular fluid compartment, and there are two subcompartments. There's the plasma, and there's the interstitial space. And those two compartments are in equilibrium with one another. So whatever the concentration of sodium is in the plasma, that's the concentration of sodium in the interstitial space or outside the cell. Next point. The point I made to you is that everything is filtered in exactly the same proportion as it exists within the plasma. So if the concentration of sodium in the plasma is 140 millimolar, Ms. Javadi, what's the concentration of sodium here in the filtrate?
140 millimolar.
That's correct, it is. So here I'm going to write concentration of sodium equals 140 millimolar. Ms. Javadi, I'm back to you. What's the concentration of sodium inside that cell?
The same.
I'll help you out. Begins with an F and ends with an N. You're one of your favorite words.
14.
That's it, you got it. The concentration of sodium inside the cell is 14 millimolar. Mr. Vadi, what's the concentration of sodium right here, or there, or over here?
140 millimolar.
2 thumbs up. Mr. Vadi, what's the concentration of sodium here?
Mm,
140.
millimolar.
There you go. Thank you. Ms. Rodriguez, if we're talking about this concept of homeostasis, homeostasis basically says that a cell has to maintain a constant internal state even though the surroundings may be changing. So Here's a sodium ion channel. Sodium ion enters into the cell. What's happened to the concentration of sodium inside that cell?
It's gonna go up.
It is, that's exactly right, it's gonna go up. Can the cell allow sodium concentration inside the cell to keep going up? No, it can't. So how does it get rid of that sodium ion?
It's just gonna have water come in to,
How's it gonna get rid of that sodium ion?
oh, with the, ion channel.
Simran, can you help her out?
Sodium pump.
Sodium, potassium, ATPase pump, right? Okay, so, you know, some of you have asked me, is the final cumulative? My answer to that was no. You don't need to know everything in the class, but there are certain things that carry with us from the beginning to the end. Membrane transport being one of those. So do yourself a favor, go review your notes on membrane transport. And the answer is, we have to maintain a constant concentration of 14 millimolar. All of you have learned that the cell is able to do this because it's got these sodium, potassium, ATPase pumps. And here's one of them. I'm just going to label this as a sodium, potassium, ATPase pump. And so we're going to take the sodium ion that came in and we're going to pump it out into the interstitial space. Jonathan, what's happening to the concentration of sodium in the interstitial space?
It's going up.
It is. And there are two compartments that are in equilibrium with one another. What are they?
The plasma and the interstitial fluid.
Two thumbs up. So the concentration of sodium now in the interstitial space rises above 140 millimolar, right? The interstitial space 140 millimolar, the plasma is 140 millimolar. Now we have an increase in sodium above 140 millimolar, and so sodium is going to go right into the peritubular capillary. Time out. Anybody have questions about that? Don't be bashful. Speak up.
How is it going to the peritubular capillary?
What's that?
How is it going to?
It's diffusing it.
Diffusing.
Yep. Question, test question time. Sodium leaves the cell, Sodium leaves the plasma. What's happening to the concentration of water here? Concentration of water is going, concentration of water is going up, right? As sodium moves into here, what's happening to the concentration of water here? It's going down. And I gave you a fundamental rule at the very beginning, and that is water always wants to be in equilibrium with itself. For wherever sodium's going, what's following along with it?
Water.
Water, right? Wherever sodium's going, water's going along with it. So here in green, we're just going to put that water is following the sodium. Oh, that was good. Water is following sodium. Because as sodium moves from one space to another, it's creating an osmotic pressure. That's what it's really doing, an osmotic gradient. And so to prevent that osmotic gradient from occurring, water's just falling right along with it. Here's another. Tubular epithelial cell. We'll put in the concentration of sodium. Also, within these tubular epithelial cells, there also are other membrane proteins. And this one we're going to describe as the sodium glucose transporter. And I'm curious, when we talk about membrane transport, we've got diffusion, and then we have carrier-mediated transport. Under diffusion, we've got diffusion through the lipid portion of the bilayer, diffusion through ion channels. Under carrier-mediated transport, there are three types of membrane transport. Anybody going to help us out and tell us what those three are? Go for it.
Facilitated diffusion.
Great.
Primary active transport, secondary active.
Fantastic. Three thumbs up on that one. This is an example of what type of carrier-mediated transport.
Secondary.
Fantastic. Secondary. That's right. Very, very good, Lisa. All right. So we've got sodium entering the cell, and this facilitates the movement of glucose into the cell using this sodium glucose carrier. By the way, these go by an acronym, the sodium glucose transporter, or SGTs. Remember, we talked about glucose transporters, GLUTs, but there also are these SGTs, these sodium glucose transporters. This is a type of secondary active transport. So glucose enters into the cell using this transporter. The sodium, of course, is pumped out of the cell using our sodium potassium ATPase pump. And here's what happens with glucose, is that with glucose, we have our GLUT on this side. And the GLUTs can actually move glucose either into the cell or out of the cell, depending upon the concentration gradient for glucose. So here I'm going to write GLUT up here. And these are GLUT2s. And now glucose is moved out of the cell into the interstitial space and then eventually into the peritubular capillary. So So there's a lot of stuff going on there in terms of membrane transport, because we've got our sodium glucose transporter, we've got our sodium potassium ATPase pumps, we've got our glucose transporters, and all this is to reabsorb glucose. This is all in the proximal tubule. So here's Bowman's capsule. Here's the distal tubule, proximal tubule. We've got the thick descending loop of Henle. That then leads to the thin loop of Henle. And here's the point I want to make, is that all, A-L-L, in capital letters, all the sodium glucose transporters are found in the proximal tubule, period. There are none in the thick descending loop. There are none in the thin loop. There is no sodium glucose transporters in the thick ascending loop, distal tubule, and collecting duct. They're only found in the proximal tubule. Go for it.
So all the cells have both the non-sodium naturals and SGTs?
Say that.
So each individual cell has both sodium ion channels and.
Correct, that's right. So her point is that these cells in the proximal tubule, they have sodium ion channels, they've got sodium glucose transporters. Yeah, that's exactly right. So let me come back to the point I'm making, because this is a really, really interesting point, I think. Is that all of our sodium glucose transporters are found here in the proximal tubule. That means that if a molecule of glucose gets into the thick descending loop of Henle, it's going to show up in the urine, because there's no way to absorb it, to reabsorb it. Now, at least for me as an instructor, here's the fun part, is connecting pieces of the puzzle together. Because when we talk about any type of carrier-mediated transport, there are three properties of all carrier-mediated transport. What are they? Go ahead, Luis, go for it.
Specificity,
Specificity, number one. Next one.
saturation.
Saturation. Yeah. So here's what's really critical, is this property of saturation. If the glucose levels in the blood are high enough, they're going to saturate the sodium glucose transporters. And that then means that glucose is going to now get into the filtrate in the thick descending loop of Henle and all throughout. And if the concentration of glucose here goes up, everybody just look up the board here, and I'll come back to this on Wednesday night. If the concentration of glucose here goes up, by definition, the concentration of water goes down, right? Down. And so you create an osmotic effect, and what's going to happen is more water is going to follow the glucose. And if more water is following glucose, what's going to happen? The excretion rate
Goes up.
is going to go up. So here's what happens. In diabetic patients, their blood sugar levels are so high that they saturate all the sodium glucose carriers. And now you create this osmotic effect where the filtrate begins to follow the glucose. And now when you talk to a diabetic patient, you sit there and talk to them and get their history. They sit there, you don't know they've got diabetes yet. You're talking to them, trying to collect the history, and you go, how many times do you have to go to the restroom at night? Well, I suspect in here the answer for young folks like yourself is either 0 or maybe once. Does that fit with any of you? All of you, hopefully? You sit there and talk to a patient who's diabetic, they might sit there and go, I'm going to the restroom 3 or 4 times a night. Why is that? Because it's got this osmotic effect due to the high concentration of glucose. And the next question, are you ever thirsty? And they go, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am thirsty. And now I'm speaking from personal experience. My father-in-law, when I first got married, I go to the house every weekend, spend time with him watching football games. He's got a big tumbler like this. He's drinking like 5 of these big tumblers a day. Well, he's diabetic. And so you have what's called diuresis. Diuresis is just a fancy word that means increased production of urine. That's what it means. Anyways, when we come back on Wednesday night, we'll pick up this story. Then we're going to get into how do we manipulate the kidney to regulate blood pressure? Because remember, this diagram is all in the cardiac algorithm. And the kidney, pharmacologically treating the kidney is a prime way for treating high blood pressure. Okay, that's it. Thanks for hanging in there. I'll see you guys.